Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm John Alger, president of James Madison University, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this fourth installment of the Madison Vision Series. As you probably know, this series brings prominent leaders to campus to look at our current civic landscape through our prism of creating an engaged and enlightened citizenry. Through the Madison Vision Fund, we're proud to sponsor the Madison Vision Series and want to thank the series co-sponsor, the Office of Madison Institutes in Outreach and Engagement, as well as all the supporters of the fund who've made this series possible. Our new vision statement talks about becoming the national model of the engaged university, engaged with ideas and the world. And our strategic plan features several facets of engagement: engaged learning, community engagement, and civic engagement. Today's speaker exemplifies all three forms of engagement and personifies a very special relationship for the university, which of course is named for the father of the Constitution and fourth President of the United States. Kat Imhoff is the president and CEO of the Montpelier Foundation. Now, how many of you have been to Montpelier, the home of James and Dolly Madison? Good. I like to see those hands up, Kat. That's a good thing. You can go back, though. They keep working on it, so it's worth going back again and again. Kat oversees all aspects of this historic treasure and the strategic integration with the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution. And I should mention, where is Doug? Doug Smith is also, here he is. Doug Smith is the vice president for the center. Do I have that right, Doug? And JMU alum. And we're also very proud to have you here today, Doug. By the way, you may notice that Doug is wearing his JMU tie today. And in honor of Montpelier, I would ordinarily be here with a purple tie, but I have my Montpelier tie on today. So we sort of exchanged roles. Thank you, Doug, for being here. Conservation and preservation have been part of Kat's life for many years. She previously held a key leadership role with the Nature Conservancy in Montana, where she assisted in conserving a wide tract of land from Montana to Canada. She also previously served as Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns and operates Monticello. She got her bachelor's and master's degrees from Mr. Jefferson's University of Virginia. Now, Kat, just so you know, in these parts, Thomas Jefferson is known first and foremost as a friend and colleague of Mr. Madison. You can see from Kat's background that she has extensive experience with the preservation and promotion of historic sites. While her past is impressive, I'm most excited about our future together. Since coming to Montpelier in January of 2013, Kat immediately reached out to deepen the relationship between our institutions. We've brainstormed about new ways we can work together to share the importance and relevance of James Madison and the Constitution for generations to come. This work builds on the long-standing collaboration between our institutions as students and faculty have helped to explore and literally unearth the legacy of the Madisons at Montpelier. In recent months, hundreds of JMU students, faculty, and staff have visited Montpelier, like many of you. Our own marching Royal Dukes rocked the house at Montpelier to help celebrate Constitution Day this past year in a way that I'd like to think would have brought a smile to the faces of James and Dolly. Teachers from across Virginia have earned continuing education credits while participating in workshops and seminars there. I count myself among the lucky ones who've participated in educational programs at Montpelier, having participated in a working conference on civics education this past fall. Under Kat's leadership, Montpelier shared artifacts with us to celebrate Madison Week last year at JMU, and the day after my inauguration here, I was honored to speak at Madison's gravesite there as we commemorated his birthday. It was on that cold, blustery day that I got a true sense of Kat's humanity and leadership. The wind picked up and it started to rain heavily. My notes were getting soaked and almost flew off the podium. Suddenly it got a bit more tranquil, and it was only later that I realized that Kat had come to the rescue behind me by holding up an umbrella behind my head as I spoke. Kat, you'll notice that we conveniently scheduled today's lecture indoors. Nevertheless, I want you to know that here at JMU, we've got your back. Kat will help us to explore ethical decision-making and leadership by examining the gray areas, sharing with us how Madison not only embodied compromise, but built it into our system of governance. Madison and his colleagues wrestled with many great challenges in their day, and we can perhaps learn a few lessons from history as we, too, attempt to navigate the gray areas of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend and colleague, Kat Imhoff.
So, speaking of the president, it is interesting times. Everyone is indeed talking about the president, even though he's a cerebral, aloof kind of guy. And his wife is glam. You know, enemies say maybe a little too glam. There are troubles abroad, and there's deadlock on Capitol Hill. And of course, we're talking about President Madison, who was in the White House 2 centuries ago, but he is still making news. In the last couple of months, the Cato Institute wrote that Madison wouldn't have let Barack Obama bomb Syria without authorization from Congress. And then the National Constitution Center came out in a Bloomberg columnist, and they both wrote that Madison would deplore the fractionalism that shut down the federal government. Writers for the Wall Street Journal said that Madison would scorn Congress and its staff members for exempting themselves from the Affordable Care Act. And Jeffrey Anderson wrote that the health care measure, though it is the law of the land, hasn't been ratified by what Madison would have called the cool and deliberate sense of the community. So for a guy who died in 1836, Madison still really gets around. And I think we're glad about that here at Montpelier and at James Madison University. It is partly why it is such a joy to be with you today, because I'm with a place and a people who actually know who James Madison is. 4th President of the United States, father of the Constitution, architect of the Bill of Rights, and thank you, President Alger and Board of Visitors and scholars, young and old, who are here tonight, for including me in this ongoing discussion about contemporary issues in engaged society. And I believe Mr. Madison would be pleased, didn't he say, and didn't you put it in the program, liberty and learning, each leaning on the other for mutual and surest support? I just love that. This is the kind of tie that can bind and does bind James Madison's Montpelier and James Madison University, liberty and learning leaning upon each other. So it is fun to be here, and it is spending some of this time this afternoon about how do we become a more engaged society? How do we build stronger community, and how do we have a more perfect union for all people? So my talk title is a little obscure, I've got to admit, and we did play around with things like shades of gray, and that got into some difficult territory, so we didn't go there. But what I would like to do with you today is share some of the stories about Madison and hint at what I think gray is. And for me, gray is those radical concepts of statesmanship, service, and accomplishment that really epitomized Madison's life, but are frankly not seen in the modern world, which tends to be very black and white, kind of action figure, leading public figures. It's not very sexy to be a person who's thinking about statesmanship and compromise and getting things done. At Montpelier, I often say, sometimes I do it sarcastically, Doug will admit, that we're not about ancestor worship at Montpelier, but rather we're aspiring to learn from the past to better engage in today for the sake of tomorrow. As you probably all know and was referenced, just a few years ago, Madison's Montpelier was open to the public after meticulously restoring the architecture. And we've interpreted Montpelier to Madison's retirement period. But for those of you who might remember the large pink DuPont house with the 55-plus rooms, we're now back down to the Madison home of 22 rooms. And it was really one of the most amazing house restoration projects in America. And we continue to fill Madison's rooms with museum objects to tell the stories of James and Dolly, and also of Montpelier's slave community who toiled to support them. People like Paul Jennings, Sonny, and a host, hundreds of other individuals that made Montpelier possible. For instance, some of the new things that we're doing, we unveiled last month, after a 5-year effort, we've reestablished, and I want to assure you it's not complete, but we've reestablished the famous James Madison Library. And this was his learning laboratory where he read the 400 volumes and he thought the thoughts about failed and struggling democracies and developed the Virginia Plan, which then became the basis for the U.S. Constitution. So this is where he was preparing for the 1787 Constitutional Convention. So I want to assure you that we're very much still a place-based organization. And we have the house and the temple and the museum collections and the grounds, some 2,700 acres, and the hiking trails and activities. And in fact, that's why I have all these images behind me. This is really sort of be my subliminal enticement to all of you to come visit and come often. But it also isn't timed, so I may say something incredibly meaningful and it will have a small butterfly behind me. So just this is a little bit of experiment with you all today. But I want you to know that we very much honor and feel that place is important. But in addition to being a place, we are also a place of the mind, meaning a radical place, in fact. At a time when political discourse can generate more heat than light, we as Americans need to really recall some of our shared history, which builds our common ground as Americans. And it is through this touchstone that we remember and build on what we've achieved and what we share. The narratives of strength and endurance and creativity and forward thinking and passion are every bit as important today as they were 200 years ago. And that is why history matters, it is why place is important, and it's why our shared stories really have continued relevance and meaning. And I really treasure what you do at JMU of holding on to the stories and being part of that stewardship. In our country and in our conversations at Montpelier, we feel, and I believe, we're poised to walk into a time when issues of freedom of speech, race and the legacy of enslavement, the contrast of what is public and what is private, the challenges of reconciling the clay feet of our great American heroes with the very difficult issues of how to found democracies and recently open societies is paramount. And as you know well, the birth of our great democracy was not without crisis, and the growth of our amazing society is still not without ongoing turmoil. So we have this fascination about who we are and where we come from, and a lot of this starts with the stories of the Founding Fathers. So I want to talk a little bit now about why medicine matters. Last fall, at Montpelier, we hosted a consortium of thought leaders and asked them to forecast what the future of civic education might look like in 25 years. Present were tech entrepreneurs, historians, former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and a select group of university presidents, including President Alger. We called this the Montpelier Salon, and it was totally experimental and meant to create a real creative collusion of perspectives and backgrounds. We asked particularly for participants to think like entrepreneurs, to imagine what the investment and the delivery system would be necessary to strengthen in the future civic engagement and leadership. And we really wanted to understand in which different institutions, how they view their roles about bringing this power of an engaged community. What are we all really going to do? So the salon yielded some fascinating exchanges, and it's really prompting us to think about our role in society. And many of these exchanges came from this rising generation of millennial leaders, some of whom are out here in the audience. But what dominated the conversation is this idea of the vitality of our engagement as citizens, that it rests on three frameworks. And I'm going to use these three frameworks for the rest of the talk to kind of share some stories about Madison. So keep these in mind if you can, kind of file them away. So framework one that came out of the Montpelier Salon, that despite the diversity of ingredients making up our melting pot or tossed salad or whatever Americanist food analogy you like to use, in our American experience, historical precedents are still really relevant to understanding our contemporary selves. This sort of seems self-evident, but it really is not for everyone. Simply put, the stories of the past are still very relevant because they do indeed form our future. That's framework one. Framework two is that community engagement is deeply, deeply personal, and it reflects what people care about. Again, sort of self-evident, But our civic identity has to be linked to our social currency. You are known for what you do. That is your personal brand, using the kind of common nomenclature today. And in attempts to engage others in citizenship, getting people to believe in citizenship, engage in citizenship, is about leveraging that recognition of positive civic behavior. And the third framework is that the most transformational experiences in our history have been led by bold risk takers. They do not solve problems, they seize opportunities. Think about that. The most dynamic changes have not been evolutionary. They have been and continue to be revolutionary, and that means change, real change, and it requires us to be intentionally disruptive. Those are kind of bold frameworks for thinking about what the future of civic engagement would be. So I'm going to start with framework number one, which is basically stories matter. We know this about ourselves. I mean, it's how you remember your own life in a series of stories, but we actually know it scientifically that people relate to stories, they relate to the emotion, and they remember things throughout their life based on the stories. So I want to share a couple of stories, some of which you may have heard before. So first story. Everyone knows George Washington as the first president. For General Washington, the position was totally undefined, and so every decision he's making, every word he is speaking, is establishing a precedence. You never think about that. And astute Washington knew that he must navigate the nuances of the office carefully. So when he planned to say a few words at his inauguration, he actually turned to James Madison to write his address. The two were very close, and the president had witnessed Madison's leadership abilities in Virginia and in Philadelphia. So here you have the first president of the United States, inaugural address written by his 36-year-old confidant, James Madison. Well, as the story goes, the formality is also new to Congress, and they think, we should do something. How should we respond to this first new president's speech? So Congress turns to one of its own to respond to the newly minted President Washington. They ask a member of the House of Representatives, you know where this is going, known for the eloquence of his quill, Congressman James Madison. So Madison responds to his own speech, which he had ghostwritten for Washington. Unless you think this back and forth is jest, it gets even more interesting. Washington, receiving Congress's eloquent response, feels he needs to respond again to Congress. So, in a letter, he turns again to his confidant and says, Mr. Madison, could you write a letter? This back and forth maybe humored Madison, we don't know. But more importantly, the story matters because it reminds us that a handful of founders had a tremendous impact, even on kind of the ceremonies and the structures we see today. And if you reflect on this lack of ego on Madison's part and his commitment to making this new government work in any way he was called on to make, well, he continues to be like this his entire life. Truly, to his deathbed, he was a statesman that worked diligently for our government. Imagine a president. Into his first term, our president realizes he has an international enemy who will not give up. An enemy that does not want America to survive. The economy is a wreck, and a divided Congress is antagonizing him at every turn. States are talking about leaving the Union. This is all sounding very interesting, isn't it? Rather than be subject to the laws that are coming out of Washington. And again, as I said at the beginning of this talk, that's Madison. That's Madison's lot. He's facing re-election, knowing that we're going to go back to war with the crown. We'd won independence from the Brits, but now the British are disrupting trade, they're seizing property, they're capturing boats, they're impressing sailors. Why do they violate these treaties and international law? Because they can. They're the strongest military in the world at that time. This is a real leadership challenge that faces Madison. And as Richard Brookhiser notes in his recent book on Madison, it's a real personal challenge to Madison because he's a legislator. That's mostly what he's done in his life. He's not an executive. He is more comfortable working in the background to discover opportunities to create change than making executive decisions from the executive branch. But this time, Madison knows what has to happen. He knows he must take bold steps, and he thrusts himself into what I must perceive for him as a very gray, difficult area. Despite it being just 4 months before election, his re-election, he asks a hostile Congress to declare war on Britain. And at the most stressful point in his presidency, he sees himself not just as a drafter of the Constitution, but he sees himself as its protector in this first armed conflict of the early Republic. Despite being told he should shut down those who criticized him, he chooses not to arrest or marginalize any of the dissenting voices of that time. He does not suspend habeas corpus, nor does he send thugs in to break up protests against his government. So stories matter because they teach us lessons. Madison is the only wartime president who does not erode civil freedoms in the face of conflict, then or now. He does not pass sedition acts. He does not commandeer privately held transportation systems. He does not intern Japanese for just being of Japanese descent. He does not open a Cuban Guantanamo prison, or he does not deny citizens access to speedy trials. Instead, he steps into the gray, the unknown, and protects the very fundamental constitutional principles that, quite frankly, every wartime president has violated to some degree. So this story reminds us of the opportunity to make right decisions even when we don't. It must have been hard. The reason Madison made the right choices goes to our second framework, and that was remembering community engagement is deeply personalized, and is fueled by what we care about. We are known for what we do, and we put the most energy into what represents our greatest passions. Madison's entire life was about giving space to dissenting voices, ensuring that they were part of the conversation in America. If anything created his civic identity, what we would call now his social currency, it was his central belief that despite the rule of the majority, the rights of all voices had to be protected. It is what makes our system work. So let's share another story. Let's talk about Madison's views on religion. Madison's enlightened education was at the College of New Jersey, which we now know as Princeton. He was not like many of the founding fathers at the 18th century party school of William and Mary. Just might remember that when you meet William and Mary alums. From UVA, you have to say things like that. So being at Princeton, it really instilled in him, that was very much a Scottish Enlightenment-led school, the importance of religious freedom. Post-college, Madison studies for the bar in 1772, but he's not very enthusiastic about this. What does really grab his attention and his passion is his observations of religious persecution. In neighboring Culpeper County, the Baptist preachers have become the prey of the Anglican establishment and are jailed for the, quote, sedition and stirring up strife among His Majesty's liege people. At the time, Virginia, as you know, was dominated by the Anglicans, and any dissenters, like the Baptists, were subject to beatings and arrests, all in the name of established religion. In fact, Madison, who, as you know, is about 5'4" and 100 pounds, even as a young man, he leaps on his horse and actually rides from Montpelier to the prison to voice his objections to this treatment. In letters that he writes subsequently to his friend William Bradford, who's in the far more tolerant colony of Pennsylvania, Madison states that the diabolical hell conceived principles of persecution, and it vexes me the most of anything whatever. I think that's so interesting, such a strong emotional statement from Madison. And in describing the broader societal effects of coercive religion, comparing Pennsylvania to Virginia, Madison says to his friend, "You are happy dwelling in a land where those estimable privileges are fully enjoyed, and the public has long felt the good effects of their religious as well as civil liberty." So a year later, the American Revolution really begins in earnest, and with it, new battles over religion. On April 25th, 1776, Madison is chosen to represent the county at the Virginia Convention in Williamsburg, and among many tasks, they're being asked to draft a new framework of government for the Commonwealth. What a very heady assignment for a young radical. Committees assemble and they prepare the state's Declaration of Rights, as well as to make a plan of government as will most likely maintain peace and order in this colony and secure substantial and equal liberty to its people. James Madison becomes a key committee member, but the committee is led by George Mason, and with few but significant revisions, Mason's proposal becomes the Virginia Declaration of Rights. There is, however, one very important revision that comes from James Madison, and it's in Article 13 of the Declaration, which originally read, "All men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of a religion according to the dictates of conscience." Madison instead believes the word toleration is far too weak, and here is what he proposes. That religion or duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force and violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. The great Madison biographer, Ralph Ketchum, summarizes the significance of Madison's amendment. The change in the word choice was crucial because it made liberty of conscience a substantive right, the inalienable privilege of all men equally, rather than a dispensation conferred as a privilege of established authorities. So it is integral to us, this right. However, the fight is not over. He gets this, by the way, into the Virginia Declaration of Rights. In the fall of 1776, James Madison is serving the House of Delegates, and he and Thomas Jefferson are appointed to a committee on religion. I'm sure they thought this was going to be a plum assignment, and instead they get many petitions because people see the door opening up. People are saying we need to disestablish the church, there need to be tax exemptions for dissenters, there needs, frankly, to be greater freedom of religion in Virginia. And the disestablishment petitioners, in fact, argue it's the very purpose of the Virginia Declaration of Rights not to have any established church. So Madison and Jefferson, they go at it, and they try to get a bill passed, no avail. They can only move this ball of religious freedom so far down the field. In the end, the church is not disestablished, though much progress is made towards religious toleration. When Madison returns to the House of Delegates in 1784, Patrick Henry has been at work. And Patrick Henry has submitted a bill for establishing a provision for teachers of Christian religion, which sounds really innocuous. It sounds like a pretty nice idea. In this bill, every property owner in Virginia would pay taxes to a Christian denomination of their choice for clerical salaries. Supporters claim, in fact, that this helps implement the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Madison, however, is incensed by the presumptions and implications of Henry's bill, and he anonymously writes something called Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, a petition. It is an incredibly elegant work, with 15 reasons, some conceptual and some very specific to Patrick Henry's bill, for opposition, and each one begins with the word because. I'll give you just a few examples. Because religious freedom is in its nature an inalienable right. Because the opinion of men, depending only upon the evidence contemplated in their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. Religion is wholly exempt from the cognizance of civil society. Because civil society itself has no right to interfere with religion, certainly the legislature, its creature, has no such right. It goes on and on. To this day, historians and scholars of religion credit Madison's essay, Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, as the most persuasive argument ever written for religious freedom. Listen to Madison. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion to all other religions may, with the same ease, take any particular sect of Christianity in exclusion to all other sects? And also Madison, the free exercise of religion implies the right to believe in no religion at all. So even the most permissive tax to support religion might violate some consciences. That phrase, no religion at all, proved very costly politically to Madison and to his friend Jefferson. But Madison stuck with it. In fact, in his draft of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, what we call the Bill of Rights, he wrote, "The full and equal rights of conscience shall not be in any manner or pretext infringed, and no state shall violate the equal rights of conscience." These were very original thoughts then, they're original thoughts now. The final wording that we do have in the Bill of Rights is not quite as strong, but it is this phrase that you will recognize: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Madison wins the day against Patrick Henry and the black sliding of legislation representing with regard to religious freedom. And in typical Madisonian fashion, he then seizes the momentum and he rekindles the push for Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia. And this passes, in fact, I think it only passes because Madison is behind the scenes and Jefferson is in France. This is Madison at his best. He is behind the scenes. He is orchestrating some of the most important and delicate of political conversations. And after the victory, he writes to Jefferson saying, "I flatter myself we have in this country extinguished forever the ambitious hope of making laws for the human mind." Like all of us, Madison's social engagement was driven by his passion, and as a president who did not free his own slaves, it is fair to say that he did not always get it right. But what we do know is that Madison's life shares a lesson for each of us, is that when we find a passion and are driven by an opportunity to create real and substantive change, we must indeed seize that day. Madison had a passion for establishing a government that would enable its citizens to participate actively, not passively, a citizenry where we can think like men and women of action and act like men and women of thought. And there are now 317 million of us in the United States to fuel powerful action. Think of this versus the 4 million in the time of Madison. Will we be remembered by how we disrupted injustice, inefficacy, dysfunction, or disunion? Which brings us back to that third framework articulated by the Montpelier Salon, which is about transformational experience. The most transformational experiences in our history have been led, as I said before, by bold risk takers who do not solve problems, they seize opportunities. And the most dynamic changes have not been evolutionary, they have been indeed continued to be revolutionary, which requires us to be disruptive. So let me have one final Madison story with you. I have alluded to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, but let's put this really plainly. The country was in trouble in 1787. The young republic was facing divisiveness, disunity, and non-functioning systems that put the states at odds with one another. When the delegates met in Philadelphia, most people thought they were going to just suggest a few little changes to the Articles of Confederation, which was what we had before the Constitution. Frankly, there'd be just a little nibbling around the edges. And the states weren't even taking the meeting seriously. Many of them spent weeks showing up, and the Virginia delegation, frankly, had to strong-arm Washington to even show up. But Madison certainly showed up, and earlier than anyone else, he arrived in Philadelphia with the Virginia Plan. Remember that upstairs library where he read the 400 books and thought about the structure of the Constitution. And he had an outline for a new government. This was not evolutionary, this was revolutionary. We'd won independence from the British, but this was a different kind of revolution. Madison came bearing an integration of fundamental constitutional structures built on a central belief that the government is powerless. We got to remember this, government is powerless. The people have the power. Representative self-government, balanced and checked by three branches, establishing federalism that ceded some power to the states while other powers were meant exclusively for the U.S. government, was a radical departure from what the world had known previously. Madison steps into the unknown, into this very gray area, just as he had done with the Baptists with religious freedom, just as he will do in the War of 1812 conflict, and really throughout his life. Where others saw conflict and weakness, he was able to see opportunity to work diligently and to be a disruptor of the present for the sake of the future. Thank goodness. The fact that a new constitution came out of that convention is really his greatest legacy in my mind, because he led the kind of revolution in Philadelphia that in my lifetime has led to dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, a velvet revolution in the Czech Republic, and fuels an Arab Spring still struggling to define its own constitutional foundations. Globally, our future, and for those of you who are in your 20s, really your future, is going to require some of you to take bold action. Whether it will be to dress, and you can make up your own list in your mind, but these are kind of the big things that worry me today. Climate change, continued freedom of conscience and religion, pandemics, gender inequality, resource inequity, terrorism. I mean, the pages are filled with it. There's no shortage of opportunities still waiting to be seized. No shortage of gray areas waiting for someone to lead a revolution of ideas, of invention, of justice, of inclusion. And while that is what we also need to remember in all of this, that history is not only about the now famous, but it is for all the stories and lives that have preceded us. Think of the changes since the original Constitution. Slavery was outlawed. That's what I love about the Constitution, is a growing, living, breathing document. Women have the vote. I'm very happy about this. Separation of church and state remains a pillar of our secular government, and this experiment in self-government is not over by a long shot. While our Constitution has inspired democracy forming around the world, there is still much ongoing battle for rule of the law in much of the world. In his essay, Walt Whitman on Democracy, Walt Whitman wrote, democracy, is a great word whose history remains unwritten because that history has yet to be enacted. I want to close with the quote that's in your program and that I used earlier. Let us go forth together, liberty and learning, each leaning on the other for their mutual and sure support. Thank you so much for listening.